Today we're making this simple rabbit out of a 1x1 inch piece of wood. And if it wasn't for the ears, I'd say that this is a beginner friendly project. But since this is a little bit of a trickier area, I definitely suggest that you have at least a few easier projects under your belt before you try this one. The first step of the process is rounding 2 of these edges. So I'm gonna make these circular curves starting from the middle of one of these faces ending up in the middle of the next face, same on the other side. And then you can remove these with rough cuts. Then I'm gonna divide the block this way into 3 sections. And I'm gonna make an S shape. It's gonna start from here, from this line. It's gonna go down like this. It's gonna curve all the way to this edge and then slightly back. And now we're gonna carve away these parts. So I'm starting with sweeping cuts. Like that. A few push cuts to make this part where the curve is an outside curve, and the same over here. That's good. Then I'm gonna divide the block into 3 again, but this time it's this way. The top third is where the head and the ears are gonna be, and for that I'm creating 2 V-cuts. So I'm gonna continue this line over here. This is where one of these V-cuts is gonna be. And then I'm dividing this into 5 sections, and the other V-cut is gonna be on this line, so the third line from the top. Something like that. And then the other one. And over here, this part can be like the wider side of this V-cut, so we can make a straight line that goes from the top corner to this V-cut over here. Then we can make this part an actual outside curve by making it rounder. That's good enough for now. Next we're gonna make a V-cut over here. So we have a slightly downturned line like that, and then we have this line where the V-cut stops. So this is one of the lines that divides this width into 3 sections. So over here I can start with sweeping cuts, because that's the easiest way to remove the biggest chunk of this wood. Like that. And then I can make a few slightly tighter sweeping cuts, and then the actual V-cuts. Then we can slim down the 2 top thirds of this rabbit. So we want the head to be about half of what it is now, which means that we can divide this into 4 and then leave the 2 ones in the middle, but we also want the ears to have a little bit more room over here on the sides, and that means we're gonna make these 2 more lines so that this edge still remains this wide, but everything else over here can be cut off up until this line. We're gonna start cutting from this top third, but we also want to make the thickness change smoothly. But first we can just make these sweeping cuts like that, the same on the other side. And then a few push cuts over here. So that the body gets slimmer pretty smoothly. Next we're gonna make this edge a little bit rounder. Just something like that is enough. And then we're gonna divide this section in half. So from there, like that. And then pretty much on the same level as this V-cut, maybe slightly lower, we can make another V-cut like that. And that's quite good. Next, we're slimming down the head a little bit. These two V-cuts need to be extended to the sides to make a rounder, nicer shape. Even with this, we now have a slightly better understanding of the measurements of the head. The angle of the ears, for example, needs to go a little bit more like this one. Something like that. And then we can move on. So from here, we're going to divide this section into two and remove this bit, because we want the nose to be the furthest away part on the front. Like that. And next, over this line, we're going to make a slanted line like this. Then we're going to make a straight line on the bottom here that meets this line. So the level where this cut is on the top. And then we can make this a bit rounder and we get a shape like that. And then this paw of the hind limb is not going to go all the way to this edge. We're going to split it in half. Something like that. Next, we're going to cut this shape. We're going to start cutting this by making a few sweeping cuts up until this line. And now we're going to make a stop cut over here on this side. And then we're going to make two V-cuts, one on each side. And the result should look something like this. And now we can continue by making another stop cut over here to create this corner. And I'm starting that with a few sweeping cuts that turn into V-cuts, and the V-cuts will then turn into stop cuts. Now we're going to want to make this curve a little bit rounder, like that, and then make an inside curve over here on the front of the front limbs. Just something like that. Next, we're going to do a lot of rounding. So we're going to take away all of these sharp edges, except that the ears are going to be a little bit different. But before we do that, we're going to reserve some space for the tail. And the tail is just going to be something like this. We're going to make a stop cut here. And then the stop cut can go around to all sides of the tail. And now that we have all of these basic features in place, we can do the rounding. And for the rounding, the most important cut is the push cut. But there are going to be situations where you're going to need some different cuts too. And when we're rounding these edges, we also need to continue this inside corner between the head and the back to the sides a little bit like this. And the same goes over here. And in all of these other corners too. We can also round these edges so that the shape curves inward again here at the bottom and doesn't just go straight down like this. These V-cuts can be extended all the way to the sides, but here on the sides they shouldn't be as deep as here on the back and the front. When you're extending this cut to the sides, when making all of this rounder, the cut should go downward like this instead of straight to the side. And it's going to meet this bottom edge. Next, some of the proportions are going to need a little bit of work. So the thickest part of the body should be around here, which means that we need to remove some of this stuff. And then the head should be just a little bit smaller, something like that. And the rabbit can also be slightly thinner this way from the top, so we can remove some of this also. But I'm gonna start with the back, and I'm gonna make a few push cuts. And then I'm moving on to the sides. And I think that even the front part here needs a little bit of work. I want the paws to be slightly further forward compared to the chest. So not only am I gonna slim this rabbit down from the sides, I'm also gonna take a little bit of wood away from the front side. Now, one thing that I think is very important in many projects, but especially in this one, it's kind of a mistake that I made with this previous one that was a little bit more detailed, is that I obsessed about keeping this cut clean. There's no reason for it to be clean before we're finished. So if you make these cuts and you want to keep this V-cut clean, it's very likely that you'll end up removing just a little bit too much wood, and then the neck is going to be thinner than you'd want it to be. So cleaning up is something that we can do later. While making the head smaller, it's important to keep in mind what the shape is that we want to make. And that's going to be something like this, with a little bit of curvature. So we don't want it to be straight, it'll look more like a rabbit with this downward turning face. Next, we're going to separate the limbs from each other. Here on the bottom, it's going to be a V-cut. And then we'll round these edges. Like that. Then over here, we're gonna make a Y shape, something like this. And in the middle of that Y shape should be this outside curve. And then here in the middle of this inside curve is the center of the Y. And again, we're starting with V-cuts. Then we can make these limbs also rounder by making small cuts to take away all the sharp corners. Over here and here, a few sweeping cuts really help with getting to continue this shape a little bit more smoothly. Next we're going to make these two curves for the legs, and that can be done with a few very tight sweeping cuts. And as you can see over here, these sweeping cuts turn into stop cuts so that we can get a clean finish in this in-between area between this knee and the front limbs. Next we're going to change the angle of the ears a little bit, and then we're going to separate the ears from each other. So a few stop cuts can be used to turn the ears slightly more forward like this, and that'll make the shape a little bit nicer. Next we're going to work on this bit. We're going to make a few sweeping cuts so that the edge between the head and the ears is not quite that straight. The ears are going to come down a little bit more like this. You can still have a V cut here in the in-between area, but it should be slightly more downward. Something like that. And then we're gonna make a few sweeping cuts over here too, because the top part of the rabbit's head is gonna be slightly slimmer, and we also want to make the cheeks a little bit rounder. So we'll make a few sweeping cuts like this. Something like that. And then the other side. Next we're going to separate the ears from each other, and that is basically the last thing we're going to do apart from some cleanup. And with this step we're basically just making V-cuts wherever it feels easiest. You can make V-cuts with the tip of the blade like this. You can make V-cuts the regular way like this, but that might feel a little strenuous at times. You might even want to make some sweeping cuts like this, because what we're trying to do is just remove wood from this area between the ears. And initially it doesn't matter how you do it. And since this can be a little bit of a tricky area due to the grain of the wood, cutting from here might just result in splitting an entire ear off if you do it with too much force. We're trying to use many different cuts so that each bit of wood we're removing would come off in the easiest possible way with the least amount of force. So if you feel the blade getting stuck like this, don't force it, just try a different angle. The easiest, smoothest feeling cuts are definitely made this way, so away from the head. So for that reason, I suggest you just do as much of this as you can, even by just slicing all of this in between wood into small bits and just slowly working to get rid of it. Over here you're also gonna need to make some stop cuts to get this area cleaned up. Here I'm switching my knife hand for a few cuts because that way it's much easier to get this clean. Other options are basically something like this or a paring cut. This can also work pretty well. Then we need to give the ears their final shape, so I'm gonna make these a bit more narrow, especially slimming them down from the front and then making this top part rounder. To add just a little bit more detail to the ears, I'm gonna be making this kind of curve that starts from the middle of this lower edge of the ear and goes over here and meets the edge over here. And then I'm gonna make a very small stop cut, a very shallow one. I'm just following this curve with the tip of the blade, and then I'm removing just a little bit of this wood. Creating something like this. And then I'm gonna do the same on the other side. And again, for this, I think it's the safest and easiest to just temporarily switch the knife to your other hand. Now there's nothing more left to do except some cleanup, if your figure needs any. And then I'm just gonna paint this with some acrylic paint.